The most important lesson I learned from those proficient gunfighters was the winner of a gunplay usually was the man who took his time. The second was that if I hoped to live long on the frontier, I would shun flashy trick shooting, grandstand play, as I would poison. I was a fair hand with pistol, rifle, or shotgun, but I learned more about gunfighting from Tom Spear's cronies during the summer of '71 than I had dreamed was in the book. Those old-timers took their gunplay seriously, which was a natural under the conditions in which they lived. Shooting, to them, was considerably more than aiming at a mark and pulling a trigger. Models of weapons, methods of wearing them, means of getting them into action and operating them, all to the one end of combining high speed with absolute accuracy, contributed to the frontiersman's shooting skill. The sought-after degree of proficiency was that which could turn to most effective account the split second between life and death. Hours upon hours of practice and wide experience in actualities supported their arguments over style. When I say that I learned to take my time in a gunfight, I do not wish to be misunderstood, for the time to be taken was only that split fraction of a second that means the difference between deadly accuracy with a 6-gun and a miss. It is hard to make this clear to a man who has never been in a gunfight. Perhaps I can best describe such time-taking as going into action with the greatest speed of which a man's muscles are capable, but mentally unflustered by an urge to hurry, or the need for complicated nervous and muscular actions which trick shooting involves. Mentally deliberate, but muscularly faster than thought, is what I mean. In all my life, as a frontier police officer, I did not know a really proficient gunfighter who had anything but contempt for the gunfanner, or the man who literally shot from the hip. In later years, I read a great deal about this type of gunplay, supposedly employed by men noted for skill with a .45. From personal experience and numerous 6-gun battles which I witnessed, I can only support the opinion advanced by the men who gave me my most valuable instruction in fast and accurate shooting, which was that the gunfanner and hip shooter stood small chance to live against a man who, as old Jack Gallagher put it, took his time and pulled the trigger once. Cocking and firing mechanisms on new revolvers were almost invariably altered by the purchasers in their interest of smoother, effortless handling, usually by filing the dog which controlled the hammer, some going so far as to remove triggers entirely or lash them against the guard, in which cases the guns were fired by thumbing the hammer. This is not to be confused with fanning, in which the triggerless gun is held in one hand, while the other was brushed rapidly across the hammer to cock the gun, and firing it by the weight of the hammer itself. A skillful gunfanner could fire 5 shots from a .45 so rapidly that the individual reports were indistinguishable. But what could happen to him in a gunfight was pretty close to murder. I saw Jack Gallagher's theory borne out so many times in deadly operations that I was never tempted to forsake the principles of gunfighting as I had them from him and his associates. There was no man in the Kansas City group who was Wild Bill's equal with a 6-gun. Bill's correct name, by the way, was James B. Hickok. Legend and the imaginations of certain people have exaggerated the number of men he killed in gunfights and have misrepresented the manner in which he did his killing. At that, they could not very well overdo his skill with pistols. Hickok knew all the fancy tricks and was as good as the best at that sort of gunplay. But when he had serious business at hand, a man to get, the acid tests of marksmanship, I doubt if he employed them. At least he told me that he did not. I have seen him in action, and I never saw him fan a gun, shoot from the hip, or try to fire 2 pistols simultaneous. Neither have I ever heard a reliable old-timer tell of any trick shooting employed by Hickok when fast, straight shooting meant life or death. The 2-gun business is another matter that can stand some truth before the last of the old-time gunfighters is gone. There were 2 guns. Most of the 6-gun toters did, and when the time came for action, went after them with both hands, but they did not shoot them that way. Primarily, 2 guns made the threat of something in reserve. They were useful as a display of force when a lone man stacked up against a crowd. Some men could shoot equally well with either hand, and in a gunplay might alternate their fire. Others exhausted the loads from their gun on the right or the left, as the case might be, then shifted the reserve weapon to the natural shooting hand, if that was necessary and possible. Such a move, the border shift, could be made faster than the eye could follow a top-notch gun thrower. But if the man was as good as that, the shift would seldom be required. Whenever you see a picture of some two gunmen in action with both weapons held closely against the hips, and both spitting smoke together, you can put it down that you are looking at a picture of a fool or a fake. I remember quite a few of these so-called two-gun men who tried to operate everything at once, but like fanners, they did not last long in proficient company. In the days of which I am talking, among men whom I have in mind, when a man went after his guns, he did so with a single serious purpose. There was no such thing as a bluff. When a gunfighter reached for his .45, every faculty he owned was keyed to shooting as speedily and as accurately as possible, to making his first shot the last of the fight. He just had to think of his gun solely as something with which to kill another, before he himself could be killed. The possibility of intimidating an antagonist was remote, although the drop was thoroughly respected, and few men in the West could draw against it. I have seen men so fast and so sure of themselves that they did go after their guns while the men who intended to kill them had them covered, and what is more, when out in a play, they were rare. It is safe to say, for all general purposes, that anything in gunfighting that smacked of show-off or bluff was left to braggarts who were ignorant or careless of their lives. I might add that I never knew a man who amounted to anything to notch his gun with credits, as they were called, for men he had killed. Outlaws, gunmen of this wild crew, who killed for the sake of brag, followed this custom. I have worked with most of the noted peace officers: Hickok, Billy Tillman, Pat Shug, Bat Masterson, Charlie Bassett, and others of like caliber have handled their weapons many times, but never knew one of them to carry a notched gun. There are two other points about the old-time method of using 6 guns most effectively that do not seem to be generally known about. One is that the gun was not cocked with the ball of the thumb. As his gun was jerked into action, the old-timer closed the whole joint of his thumb over the hammer, and the gun cocked in that fashion. The soft flesh of the thumb ball might slip if the man's hands were moist, and a slip was not to be chanced if humanly avoidable. This thumb joint method was employed whether or not a man used the trigger for firing. On the second point, I have often been asked why 5 shots without reloading were all a top-notch gunfighter fired when his guns were chambered for 6 cartridges. The answer is merely safety. To ensure against accidental discharge of the gun while in the holster due to hair trigger adjustments, the hammer rested upon the empty chamber. As widely as this was known in practice, the number of cartridges a man carried in a 6 gun may be taken as an indication of a man's rank with the gunfighters of the old school. Practiced gun-wielders had too much respect for their weapons to take unnecessary chances with them. It was only with tyros and woodbyes that you heard of accidental discharges, or didn't know it was loaded injuries in the country, where carrying a Colt was a man's prerogative.